Okay. So, as a start, please, could you just say and spell your name?
I'm Harry Lewis, Harry Lewis, and I am professor of computer science at Harvard.
Great. Could you please start us off by just giving me, and you can be as elaborate as you'd like,
Yeah.
but a kind of autobiographical sketch of your own travels through the world of higher education?
Yeah, I've actually had reasons to think and talk to people about this lately. A little of it spilled out into the dialogue I had with Bill Deresiewicz that was in the Chronicle of Higher Education recently. So I came to Harvard as a freshman 50 years ago this fall, actually, in 1964. My parents were both children of immigrants who managed to get educated. Okay, no education in my grandparents' generation, and it was just sort of classical American story of poor immigrant families and children who were ambitious and probably had at least one hard driving parent on each side probably. And so, but I was raised I went to good school. I went to the Roxbury Latin School in Boston, which is a fine, classically oriented, independent school, and was fortunate enough to I was a good student there because I had a hard driving mother probably, and came to Harvard, and I loved the college experience. Was tremendously excited by getting to do research in computer science. I mean, I didn't know what I really wanted to do, even in terms of, so I sort of knew I was sort of vaguely mathematically oriented, but I figured out in college a number of things about myself, that one of them being that I wasn't a real mathematician, because they thought I was when I was in high school, but not when I when I got out of the amateur leagues of high school mathematics, I discovered that I wasn't. So, but I also, it was very formative because I got to see science being created and for the first time after all of this classical education, I began to see that what you did in school was not just learn, but work on stuff that nobody knew the answers to, actually. So that was there was sort of a little light bulb thing went off there. For various reasons having to do with my my family life, I got married. My wife hadn't finished college at that point, and so on. There was the Vietnam War, and I went and did several years not in Vietnam, but in service that was equivalent to military service. So it got me off the hook for going into the Army. I wound up back in Cambridge and starting my PhD, probably again without thinking about it too much. I enjoyed the computer science research, and it seemed like the next right thing to do, but I certainly had no intention of being a professor when I started on a PhD in computer science. Really, technically applied mathematics at that time, because there was no such thing as a computer science degree as such. And again, it was sort of accidental that I took the job. I had a number of industrial offers to go, but the Harvard job was open, and I thought, what could be better than that, being a Harvard professor? And I was bound again to the Boston area because my wife was in the middle of her PhD program by the time that happened. So we had these sort of interlocking timelines for a long time, and over the years I've been teaching, which is 40 years now. I've had I've always had this kind of dual existence. So I've had a very productive teaching career because I've had incredibly good students to work with, and I like teaching big courses, and I like teaching the subject as it's coming alive, and obviously there've been a lot of changes in computer science over the years, and so I've always enjoyed the teaching, but I've also gotten to be in love with the institution itself. The institution, Harvard as an institution, which of course has been so formative for me and my wife both, and then just the institution of higher education and what its significance is for American society. And that just, again, it's in part just because I've seen it change so many lives, which, in my maturity, I've recognized as exactly the way it changed the lives of my own parents, coming from, whose lives were, 1,000 times better than anything that their parents had, because they both managed to get not only college degrees, but then medical degrees after that. So working in a university has, in some sense, given me a sense of social satisfaction with my place in society, that I'm, doing something. And so that's sort of the lens through which, one of the lenses through which I think about the importance of the university as an agent of social progress, broadly construed. So that's sort of this. So then what happened? I became, for various reasons, the go-to guy to sit on all kinds of committees, and I was elected multiple times to our faculty governance, something called the Faculty Council, which is an elected group of faculty, sort of what other places might call a faculty senate, and various things. And anyway, after I'd done enough of the sort of administrative and committee work, I was made dean of the college. First, I was actually I was asked to review the whole structure of the administration of the college. That was in 1994, and I chaired a faculty committee that did an extensive review of where undergraduate education, including the residential and extracurricular part, had come and where it was going, and how the organization of the dean's office should change. And that's probably where I really got, for the first time, to read into the sort of deeper into the history of higher education. And we produced a report, and then I was asked to become dean. Essentially, if you're so smart, why don't you implement things that you say? So they made me dean of the college in 1995, which I did for 8 years.
This is under Bach?
Originally it was under Rudenstein and under Jeremy Knowles as dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and then Rudenstein was succeeded by Summers, so went into the Summers years, and different people will describe my relations with the Summers years, but anyway, I woke up one day in 2003 to learn that I was not going to be dean anymore, and my characterization of this is that the president decided he would prefer to have deans around him who would tell him he was right. So that wasn't the role I was willing to play, and so I went happily back to teaching, which is what I've been doing since then. And then I wrote this book, Excellence Without a Soul, as I say, partly just to put together a lot of stuff that I'd learned, which I thought provided interesting, context for changes that were happening in higher education, and also to sort of exercise some ghosts of my own experience.
Great. So, as someone who is kind of a fan of higher education and someone who has really spent a lot of time looking under the hood, can you talk about what you regard as the most significant changes that you've seen in this institution and or in higher education in general across the 40 years that you've been involved in faculty. And maybe talk a little bit about the timing of some of those changes, too.
Yeah. Well, so I'm going to answer this question in two ways. By the way, there's a guy you should talk to. Do you know Richard Hyland? You know who Richard Hyland is?
No.
So Richard Hyland is a law professor at Rutgers. He was a member of the Harvard class of '69, the great revolutionary class, and he was a lead revolutionary. And late in life, he went on. He's a very serious legal scholar in his particular area, but sort of late in life, he's regretted the fact that he never got an education at Harvard because he was always, carrying torches and stuff, and it really was barely present. I mean, he managed finally. They awarded him his degree, but it was a heavily interrupted life, and he's actually acquired a great fondness and respect for education. So he's trying to write up something, and exactly what it is changes every time I talk to him. But to reconstruct what the intellectual life of Harvard was in the '60s and how it's changed since then. So he's a really interesting guy to talk to if you want to set up another interview. Hyland. Okay. So I guess there's two ways to answer that question. There's the data-driven way, and then there's the sort of philosophical or spiritual way. So let me try the data-driven way, first of all. And it's a sort of trite answer, which sounds like it came out of the press office of any institution, but it's, it's so trite that people don't realize that it has consequences. So I'm teaching now in 2014 an entirely different student body than the student body that I taught in 1974, right? I mean, first of all, at Harvard, somewhat peculiar to Harvard, the gender ratio has changed enormously, and that changes lots of things about the sociology of the classroom, the sociology of housing, the number of people who take road trips. Nobody takes road trips on weekends anymore because those were always, to some degree, mating exercises, when men all headed off to Western Massachusetts where all the women were, so there's all kinds of circumstances of student life that people don't recognize have been changed by simple things like that. And then, of course, more recently, the fact that we are teaching many more students who are, as we say, of more diverse backgrounds. But the point where it really matters to me in the classroom is not because I think ethnic diversity or anything like that is in itself changes the tenor of the classroom, but the fact that as a matter of policy, Harvard and practice, Harvard now really tries hard to find, bright, ambitious, promising students who have maxed out their schools, even when their schools are lousy. I used to go into when I was orienting faculty about the student body, back when I was dean, and things have changed a lot in the last decade since I stopped being dean. I used to say, you're going to have the privilege of teaching, the best students from the best schools in North America, and also the best students from some of the worst schools in North America, and that's a real challenge. And my sense is that a lot of my faculty colleagues haven't kind of woken up to the fact that if you grew up in a household where they don't read books, and you maxed out your school where they don't actually read poetry,
right, or they don't have books,
or they don't have books, or whatever, you can't make the same assumptions. I've actually talked or had reports from two humanities professors here who said diametrically opposite things about their teaching experience. One said, these students are they're so careerist, they're so oriented towards making money, they're not interested in books, and they're not interested in, I don't want to teach people who've never read a poem before. And then there was another humanities professor who said, it's so fabulous to teach these students who've never read a poem before. I'm the one who gets to introduce them to this. This is where I can have a real impact. Not the people who went to the fancy boarding schools are going to be okay. They I love working with them too, but I can't have the impact on them that I can have on. So just while we're still on the first part of my division here, I think the faculty social contract about what their job is now very unclear. And actually, if you read this morning's Crimson, actually, there's a story about computer science, our big computer science course. And I'm quoted near the end of the story describing the computer science faculty as evangelical. Okay? That we love it when we convert students from other disciplines, take the economists and to show them that the cool stuff is all happening in computer science, right? And that's a general attitude, not just among the Harvard computer scientists, but I think you actually find it around. I think if you talk to Joan Feigenbaum, who's the chair of computer science at Harvard, a student of mine, by the way, that she'd tell you the same thing. And there are. But that's not the only. There are other faculty who feel either that their job is neutral, their job is to teach whoever shows up, or that their job is to teach of all of these great unwashed that the Harvard admissions office, for whatever reasons of their own, because they have to run a lacrosse team or whatever it is, have chosen. They want to teach just the ones that they want to teach. They want to do a second kind of admissions process and and choose those among them. So the social contract is very is something nobody really talks about. That is to say, what's your real job here? What's and why do you want to do it? And that it didn't used to be something we had to talk about when most of our students arrived at Harvard pretty well educated, but they don't anymore. There's enormous variance. Forget about the ethnic and gender and all these other dimensions. The real the thing they've got in common is they're all bright and ambitious. I mean, not all, but that's mostly those are that admissions looks for those things, and those things are hard to fake. But but they're being drawn from very different geographical and socioeconomic circumstances, and because they're mostly American students, and because we are a federated republic here, where every damn school district decides for itself whether it's going to teach evolution or not, the background is very, very irregular, even among the best students.
Mm-hmm. But this division that you're describing within the faculty, is there a generational dimension to that, or is it just a matter of kind of personal temperament?
It's not merely generational. I'm reluctant to generalize on that. I'm reluctant to suggest that the old people are the problem and the young people aren't, because I think the older generation of faculty are. I think it's very complicated, because the question is, where does this come from, right? And the older generation of faculty includes a lot of, just to use a term, lefties who are totally on board with the education as social transformation agenda, and are quite, they would be in, some of them, they would quite happily be in the category of people who think it's fun to teach people who don't know anything or know relatively little. Others who have always been more graduate teachers and research scholars and so on, are less interested in teaching some of the people who don't have the background. In the younger generation, which you might have thought would be, and probably the data show are equally, politically progressive, but it's entirely made up of people who are under much more intense pressure for scholarly publication and raising research funding and doing all of these non-pedagogical things that have always been part of the professor's job, but the competition on the pressure on younger faculty is much worse than it ever was. And, that has been accompanied by, and maybe has caused to some degree, a disintegration of interdepartmental faculty culture. So in 2 or 3 decades ago, I would go over to the faculty club after work, and there was a bar downstairs with peanuts and beer, and I would sit down with my friends in the classics department and in the university administration, and we would have a couple of drinks before I went home at night. And they've closed down the bar. Just nobody would go. Everybody's got
too much email to answer.
Too much email to answer. Too many grant proposals to write. Got to pick the kids up from daycare. Which is much more a shared responsibility. It was easier, when only one parent had all of those duties. I'm not saying, this is a lot of these things, as I say, they're problems that are created by our successes in other areas. But now your faculty friends are your departmental friends, and so there's much less sense of being part of a college in the sense of a collegium, a collective faculty that has collective responsibility for the whole undergraduate student body. So that's part of it too. So I don't think it's generational. It's associated with that. Okay, so now I guess the other thing that I was going to say is, kind of hinges off that last thread that I brought up about the change in faculty culture and the change in the social contract. I think the university has become much more bureaucratized and rule-driven. And there are lots of good reasons for that happening, but it's had some noxious consequences. So the good reasons for that happening are a couple. I mean, one is we just had to, because we get so much, the federal regulatory apparatus is much more, much, bigger than it used to be. So we all, all kinds of people now have to get sexual assault training, and every penny of grant money has to be accounted for in ways where we used to get much sloppier, and we're all supposed to encrypt our laptops, and all the rest of this stuff. There's all kinds of good reasons. The federal the federal privacy laws as they relate to educational records have changed some business processes. So, and the other way in which we've become more bureaucratized, and I think about this in the context of the faculty in particular, is that standards for faculty hiring and promotion are much clearer and are meant to be much more objective than they used to be, which I should be interested to see somebody. People told me that my timeline on this doesn't line up with the timeline of the other changes that I'm talking about. But for some reason, I have the sense that when we became conscious of our own nepotism and inbreeding and the way we used our subjective judgments of faculty candidates to exclude women and to make those value judgments in a way that at least in practice wound up with very biased appointment histories, records. We stopped hiring people because they were Professor Jones's best PhD student, and we started, advertising and making sure, having blind letters and making sure that on every short list there was at least one woman, and who was the strongest minority candidate. There's all kinds of stuff that we now do in the hiring process, and I think it's while again it's had many good effects, it's actually made people afraid to hire people because they think they're good people, and not hire them because they think they're bad people, right? Because we're supposed to be looking at the things we're supposed to be looking at, which is, research and teaching and citizenship, and those are the bases on which we're supposed to be promoting people. So, and how much weight is actually given to teaching is, different on different institutions, but here it's not the most important factor, to be sure. And, so there's a lot of stuff that used to be in the vein of kind of civic commitment to education of the whole person, a sense. My own historical analysis of this is that, we all, I'm well aware of this, that, whatever age you are, the golden era was when you were young. Life has gone downhill since then. But, when I was in college in the late 60s, there was still some of the old guys who were, who'd come out of the Second World War experience and the near death of human civilization, and had sort of brought that horror into the curricular discussions about what the general education curriculum would look like in the post-war era at Harvard. General education in a free society. They were actually thinking that, free society was not to be taken for granted. And if we couldn't do something about preserving it through the way we educated our students, then there was no reason to think it was going to survive. So that some of that spirit still survived. It was already in the 60s. It was waning, and there were all kinds of other, social revolutions aborting because of the war and the draft and the recognition of the inferior status of women and African Americans and so on. So there are all kinds of other reasons why that old kind of feeling about what universities should be doing for civilization was being eclipsed by other agendas. But somewhere, and I attribute it to these two factors, to the regulatory structures imposed by the government and our own best efforts to prevent ourselves from social biases of various kinds, have wind up kind of sterilizing a lot of the incentive and reward structure for faculty, where faculty are rewarded for publishing papers, for getting high student evaluations in their teaching, and they know they're going to get marked down if they don't do anything administratively. So it's not like nobody tries to be a good committee member or something like that. But and then and a lot of other things that we used to value in our most valued colleagues, we still value in our most valued colleagues, don't turn up in the criteria on which they're going to be promoted, or in the criteria on which that we're supposed to be applying when we hire them. So I think I have a feeling that the incentive and reward structure for faculty has become, as I say, sort of morally and civically sterile, and that's part of the source of some of the sense of aimlessness that I think students experience. Students inherit the same thing. Their job is to do good physics in their physics course, and take one of each kind of general education course. Our general education program now is essentially some kind of distribution requirement. It's not, and there's no, you can find some language where people try to wrap some
philosophy around
some philosophy around it, but it's just a philosophy of that liberal education is education is learning for learning's sake, which it actually isn't. Liberal education is actually, the liberal in liberal education is, it's the learning that free people are supposed to have. That's where the liberal, it's that in Roman times, the liberal arts were the things that you were supposed to have if you were a Roman citizen, as opposed to whatever the slaves needed to know, right? Those were the writing, speaking, and all the rest of that, arithmetic, and and so on. So the notion that the reason why you have in the American system, in places like Harvard, a general education and not a pre-professional education, we've lost sight of the fact that all of that stuff was to prepare you for your life, for life as a citizen, as a kind of social leader, or at least a social participant, and it's just been reduced to this this sort of checkbox formula that you're going to be liberally educated if you've taken at least one course in each of the following 8 areas, but right. no real tissue holding them together.
So you're describing a series of kind of tears in the social fabric, tears within the university, maybe tears between the university and the
larger society.
And so I guess a couple of things. First of all, just to kind of flesh out your ideas here, are there any other things you want to put on the table as part of this general phenomenon that you've described as kind of soulless excellence in the university system? Are there other pieces to this that need to be brought up?
Well, so again, I shouldn't have a conversation like this without mentioning money. And money's important in 2 ways. It's important because it costs a lot of money to go to college now, and there's so much in the air about the impact that student debt is having on the American educational system. It's not a huge issue for me sitting in my privileged position here in O2138, because we have such good financial aid that effectively none of our students has to worry about graduating with enormous debt from their undergraduate degree. If they go to medical school, that's a different story, of course. But so it's not a major factor, but it's still out there because they all have siblings who are, and parents have made huge sacrifices to enable them to get enough education so they can get this far, and so on. But it's not the same kind of, thinking of America in a larger sense. I'm a little puzzled, frankly. Well, I'm going to say two things. So two things I want to say about money. There's the student debt issue, and then I want to come back and talk about careerism. So, but the student debt issue I find puzzling because the average student debt with which an American student graduates is 2 years of the delta between the average salary they would have had without a college degree and the average salary they get with a college degree, right? So assuming you can somehow figure out how to get there, you're going to graduate with $30,000 or something like that in debt on average. And the difference in starting salary between someone with a college degree and without a college degree is $15,000, right? So you get it, you make it all back in 2 years. So I'm actually a little puzzled that this is a problem, except that I think there are probably a lot of people who are persuading people to take on lots more debt than they should, and so there's a whole thing that's broken there, and there's a thing that's broken in the support of the states for their state university system. So this is not something, again, that touches me directly. In a competitive sense, it only works to our favor because now it's cheaper for some lower middle class student from Michigan to go to Harvard than to go to the University of Michigan. So we're getting even better students than we would otherwise get because we're cheaper than the state, than the university. I say the University of Michigan because that's where my mother went. So that's crazy as a national, as a matter of national policy. And I think, just to finish this off, we could go on in this vein for many hours, but just to put it on the table there, as you said, there's a tear there are tears not just within the institution, but between the institutions of higher education and society that surrounds them. And I think, we're partly to blame because given our own aimlessness, so because we can't explain to ourselves what we're doing, we can only do it in the micro. We're doing teaching and research in computer science. You're doing teaching and research in history, but what is the institution as a whole doing for the student as a whole? Because we have no vocabulary anymore to explain that. Society doesn't understand it either. And they just say, well, then at least, produce competent widget makers or something, and so we're going to cut you're charging too much and you're producing too little, and because we don't have any vocabulary for explaining what we're actually doing. So that's so we're part of that problem, but I think it's a national tragedy. I was at Cornell yesterday, and I just looked up at the seal, founded 1865. Founded 1865 in part as a byproduct of the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1863, where this country, in the middle of the goddamn Civil War, when they had a million other more important things to think about, started pumping huge amounts of resources into building up universities in every state, and here we are in a time of, all things considered, relative prosperity, and this is the time we decided it's time to cut the, we don't need more educated citizens. So that all is okay. So that's all one side of it. Then, so the other side of the money equation has to do with the alleged materialism of our student body, right? There's you hear a lot of this kind of discussion that the students are not, they're not intellectually motivated. They just want to get jobs. They just want to make lots of money. They arrive, and so again, to the extent this is true, and I don't know any, controlled studies that totally persuade me about it, but it's, as I've said, a byproduct of two things. One, a bad consequence of something very positive, and two, our own lack of evangelism about what education is really for. So the good thing that it's a consequence of is that we now have lots of students who have no money, and his parents didn't have any money, and and if we don't tell them anything else, they've grown up thinking that doctors, lawyers, engineers, bankers, maybe, probably not, are and they got, three sisters who are, don't go to places like Harvard and having to borrow lots of money, and parents are in debt and all the rest of that stuff. It's not terribly surprising that more students now than when most of our students were relatively well off think about making money as one of the things that college is going to enable them to do. This is not rocket science, right? There is a reason why people come in oriented this way, and it's not, because somehow Harvard has gone out and found the most self-centered, materialistic people they could find. They found a lot of the poorest people they could
So
find.
it's a byproduct of our own idealism.
Absolutely. But then we've got an educational responsibility to, make sure that people don't wake up as miserable 35-year-old lawyers, the way many of the lawyers I know who've graduated from Harvard and gone on to law school do, saying, I hate this. I'm just writing derivatives contracts 24 hours a day and not getting any sleep and never seeing my kids, and why am I doing this, right? So that's an educational a kind of holistic educational role that we have, which is hard to undertake in an institution where the incentive and reward structure for faculty is based on teaching and research, and to some degree on national reputation, and which is so that's a whole thing where we play to our peers. The most important thing for my career as a computer science professor has absolutely nothing to do with what my colleagues in the classics department think of me. It has to do with what my computer science colleagues at Cornell think of me, right? So of course we're going to respond to the incentives that are out there, and I wish the leadership of the university of universities, not just this one, would find ways to articulate and make somehow real these other educational responsibilities. It would be wrong to have an interview about higher education without talking about money somewhere. So that would be the other one.
So you started to get us into this realm, but let's talk about it more elaborately. So in policy terms, both kind of within the university, as you began to talk about, but maybe as a society at large, maybe in the broader realms of governance and kind of civic discourse in general. In policy terms, what are the sites of intervention to be made, and what are the specific interventions that could have a kind of meaningful leverage on changing these things that you're describing?
Yeah, so I actually think so within the institution, I actually don't think this is so hard and would not require drastic changes to the way we do business. But the definition of success has to be changed somehow. And it has to be changed, by the president and probably, by the governing boards in a way that gets down to the deans and the department chairs about the way faculty are going to be hired and incentivized and promoted. And um, we
Can I
should.
just pause to say how enormous that is right there, though?
Well, but small. You could. But
Well, no,
small,
I mean, I understand what you're saying, but knowing the fabric of universities as you do, doesn't that just seem like a Herculean kind of task?
If you did it a little bit, people would notice. People would notice. I mean, I think I actually have more confidence in the goodwill of the faculty on some of these things than I might sound. There are faculty who really care about some of these moral civic roles, but feel kind of lonely, like nobody's going to notice, and there are there are ways to encourage people to get together for to stop eating the sandwiches at their desks, right? I mean, just like buy free sandwiches, right? Just say just like set aside a table in the faculty club or in the science center or something like that, and say the food's here free, but you got to have lunch with somebody from another department. This stuff, simple stuff like this that and the way we do a horrible job evaluating here at Harvard. Here at Harvard College in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, we do a terrible job evaluating teaching. For example, we just stick the student evaluation data into the tenure dossier, and we know those data are just based on whether you're likable or not. I mean, that's been scientifically proven, right? It has nothing to do with whether you're teaching anybody anything. And so, so that requires a little more work. We need some kind of peer evaluation where we visit each other's classes. But I mean, this is one of my, this just drives me crazy. The woman next door is fabulous. She came here as assistant professor, MIT educated, MIT undergraduate, MIT PhD, junior faculty through Harvard all through 7 years. And you went through after 7 years, she gives a research seminar, the tenure talk, and then we get the dossier together and our list of publications and the student evaluations and all the rest of it. And we go into a faculty meeting, discuss them, and we vote up or down to recommend her upward for tenure. And then there's a process beyond our head. Sat there in the room. There's 40 of us or something like that, and we've all watched her with her open door, very friendly person, all the rest of it. Nobody had ever seen her teach. Nobody had ever seen her teach. We'd all seen her give a research seminar, and we'd all read her papers, and we all knew what the students said about her teaching, just thumbs up, thumbs down. It's crazy, right? It's crazy. It's you wouldn't do that with a police officer or a fireman, right? I mean, you don't like. This is not rocket science. How you improve quality of any kind of service provision, and this is a kind of service that we're providing here. So, but it's an inheritance. It's funny. The you hear this stuff about universities should be run more like businesses, and that unfortunately is an abuse of the terminology, because you have to decide what business you're in before you decide to run it like a business. people who say run it like a business means, that they want to measure how many units of output there are for every unit of, cost that's going into the system. And
right. Which was one of my questions, actually, in your 40 years.
Yeah.
Are universities run more like businesses than they were when you started?
Well, only in the most shallow sense. It's actually, I mean, and every company goes through this, but and it's it's always an interesting problem in American society in general is, what is the business that Burger King is in, right? Is Burger King in the business of selling hamburgers? Is Burger King in the business of maximizing, shareholder profits? In which case you move to Canada, right? So, or is Burger King in the business of producing good food for people who want to eat it? We don't have we haven't had that kind of conversation except in the most sort of shallow sense about what we're doing in universities. So I would actually be quite happy to run Harvard like a business, have Harvard run more like a business, as long as we got a common definition of what the business was that we were in, and I think we're in the business of creating the future citizens and leaders of society, not just American society, but world society. And we've actually done a pretty good job at that over the past, 300 and something years. But it's now gotten, atomized and chopped into such little non-communicating pieces that we're doing. Well, this is where you can see where the title of my book came up. We're producing actually excellent results, if you define the objective function correctly. How many what's the average board scores on the people who take graduate record exam? I don't know what's our admissions record, people applying to law schools and medical schools. There's all kinds of, how many members of Congress have Harvard degrees? We're succeeding fabulously on all of these, but I don't know that we're doing a very good job getting people ready to take over responsibility for preserving civilization.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in addition to the kinds of reorganizing within universities about kind of thinking about merit, thinking about the metrics of success, thinking about rewards and incentives for faculty, and kind of really changing the culture in that way. What are some of the other interventions, either inside the university or at other levels?
Well, so again, on the national level, which is really, frankly, a much more important issue than what's going to happen to Harvard. Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, they're going to be fine. We almost went broke, and we got to all raise more money. But basically, we're in a competition against each other to stay. Who's going to be on the very top of this quite lofty pyramid. In any reasonable national sense, the problems in higher education are the problems in the state university systems. And perhaps the community colleges and the other state institutions, state-run institutions, government-run institutions, public institutions that feed those. Because, and again, I consider it a national problem because it's you can't run a democracy with a ignorant, illiterate, uneducated citizenry, and we like to think that we're so much more sophisticated than people were 150 years ago, but we're not. I was looking back at the Lincoln Douglas debates, which drew huge audiences.
And neither of them spoke in sound bites.
There were 7 of them. They alternated who started. Whoever started went for an hour. The other guy went for an hour and a half. And then the first guy got a half-hour rebuttal. They did this for 3 hours, and they moved down to the next county, and they did it all over again 7 times. It's it's incredible, and people. I mean, or I'm just thinking, I was giving a talk yesterday about anonymity, and it's civic importance of anonymity. This is something that's under attack. And I looked at Thomas Paine's Common Sense, an anonymous document. Anonymous. They didn't even pick a pseudonym. It's just like, here it is. It's a disquisition on this British monarchy, and all this is a treasonous piece of tripe. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. I mean, it was a huge bestseller. People sat around at night reading this, and and this is why the whole thing got started. Can you imagine anything like that happening today? So you really need, if you're going to run a democracy where you're going to elect people to make decisions on about the future of society, the citizenry has to be educated, and so the somehow the loss of faith that the country, through its elected representatives, is showing in the value and importance of higher education, or the extent to which the only value that it's willing to attach to higher education is professional training rather than civic virtue or civic engagement or something like that, is, I think, a serious problem for the country. And that, and the debt and all the rest of that is wrapped up with it, but so that's a much more serious problem than the question of whether Harvard's incentive and reward structure for its faculty is wrong. I guess it's I just want to keep things in perspective, given with all due pride in this institution. I also know that it's not where the real large problems are ever going to be solved.
Well, we're just about out of time, but is there any parting comment that you want to offer? Is there anything that we haven't discussed that we should have?
No, you've gotten me exhausted, actually.
Well, thank
I'm
you
also
very much.
exhausted because I had to drive back and forth to Cornell in 2 days.